Oh boy, this is going to be good because in this video we're talking about one battle and one battle only. You've probably heard of a little battle called Gettysburg. Well, let's talk about it some more. See, the last time we had a video, we talked about George Gordon Meade getting command of the Army of the Potomac in the spring of 1863 after Hooker was beaten at Chancellorsville. And remember, Robert E. Lee was feeling pretty cocky and started invading the North. And poor Meade has to catch him. Well, now we're going to talk about really the only major battle fought in a non-slave state. And it's not just a major battle. Gettysburg is the single largest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere, as far as we know, as far as recorded history is aware of. No battle in the entire Western Hemisphere has ever been bigger. And if you ever get the chance to get to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, highly recommend it. I've been there about 6 times. I'll go again as many times as I can. You got to check this place out. But for now, the best we can do is visit there in this video. And as we go to Gettysburg, just to remind you, this is the scene. You've got poor George Meade trying to bring the Army of the Potomac together in the aftermath of Chancellorsville and to try to catch Robert E. Lee as he's moving up into Pennsylvania. It's almost like history was repeating itself with McClellan taking his time catching Lee up in Maryland. If you remember, Lee got so far ahead of McClellan that he had split his army up in Maryland. This time he couldn't be so cavalier about things because, if you remember, Jeb Stuart, who was the commander of the Confederate cavalry, had always been sort of the eyes and ears of the Confederate army, had always been able to report to Lee where the Union army was. Jeb Stuart and the Confederate cavalry were kind of nowhere to be found. At the end of June 1863, Stuart, we now know, was off gallivanting around in Maryland, getting kisses from women and having flowers thrown at him because they all thought he was so hot. He was kind of derelict in his duty. Lee really didn't know exactly where the Union army was at this point, so Lee was sort of feeling around blind, even though he was in Pennsylvania before the Northern forces were. Meade's army was taking their time getting up through Maryland. It was hard to catch up. They sort of made their way into Pennsylvania in fits and starts and small chunks. And so when the Battle of Gettysburg actually started, it's interesting. For the first time in really the entire Eastern theater of the war, the South actually had more men at the field when the major battle began because most of the Union army wasn't in Pennsylvania just yet. When the fighting began, it was because a Confederate general named A.P. Hill and his men needed some supplies, things like shoes, food, whatnot. And they chose the town of Gettysburg because it was the nearest town to where they happened to be marching. They came into town on June 30th and started realizing that this might be a decent spot for a battle and reported this to Lee, and Lee started sending more troops there. The thing in the picture I want to show you is a building that still stands today, and it was there in June and July of 1863. It's a Lutheran seminary. A seminary is a school that trains ministers, in this case for the Lutheran Church. And it has this white tower on the top that happens to be the highest point in the Gettysburg area. When the small batches of Union soldiers started to arrive in Pennsylvania, this man here, John Buford, who was one of the commanders of the Union cavalry, saw all sorts of hills and ridges in the area. And he saw this because he saw this Lutheran seminary on the top of a hill north of town, climbed to the top, climbed to this white tower, got his binoculars out, looked all around the field and realized that south of town, there were all sorts of ridges and hills that would be strategically advantageous if the North could get their men on those high grounds. So he was able to see all this and get word to the rest of the Union, you better get up here quickly. If we can get this high ground before the South does, we'll be in much better shape. And I got to tell you, if you get to Gettysburg today, you can walk those ridges, you can stand on those hills, you can see the elevation that these men saw. And I'll show you on this map what Buford was seeing. Here's the town of Gettysburg itself, which is still, like I say, definitely worth a visit. In fact, one of the cool things about Gettysburg is there are buildings in the town that are still standing that were there when the battle was fought in 1863, and they all have plaques on them that show that they were actual buildings that existed at the time, and they all have bullet holes on the side. It's kind of amazing. And in fact, if you get to that town, it's kind of like a Civil War Disneyland almost, because there's so many souvenir shops and tours you can take. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So here's the scene. Here's Gettysburg. And you see to the south all these ridges. You see Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge and Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill. Cemetery Hill already had a cemetery on it. Of course, today the big soldier cemetery of the dead from Gettysburg is there now. But these are the sorts of hills and ridges that Buford was seeing. When the battle began, though, on the first day of July, it's just a small Union force north of town that's going to actually be attacked from the north by the Confederates that were already in Pennsylvania. And when it began, I want to introduce you to someone who you barely have a chance to get to know. John Reynolds was one of the highest-ranking generals in the Union Army. In fact, a lot of viewers thought that Reynolds would have been a better fit to take over when Joe Hooker quit than George Meade was. People were kind of upset that he had been passed over. So Reynolds got to the field pretty early on the day of July 1st. And he's riding around, ordering his men in position. He sees the situation. He's trying to get people ready to fight against the Confederates at Gettysburg. And out of nowhere, a sniper's bullet comes from the top of a nearby barn. And I said, you wouldn't need to know John Reynolds very much because he's gone. Bye. This is the kind of chaos of battle. Well, as the fighting continued and as the Union was trying to get its way up there, I wanted to not introduce, but mention somebody that I think is kind of a unique little footnote to history. You've probably never heard the name Abner Doubleday, but if you have, it's probably associated with the history of the sport of baseball. See, this is kind of fun. Abner Doubleday was a Union general, and he took command of the Union troops in the field after John Reynolds got shot. And Doubleday did a fine job trying to organize the Union position against the Confederate assault on the first day of the fighting. But today, he's more famous for something he didn't even do. See, after the Civil War, the new sport of baseball was trying to get more attention and more public awareness, and they sought some American hero that they could associate with the sport. So for a lot of crazy reasons, a myth started to grow that General Abner Doubleday of the Union Army had invented the sport of baseball. And this myth kept growing and growing to the point where now, I don't know if you know, the National Baseball Hall of Fame is in a town called Cooperstown, New York, which is also worth visiting. You should check it out. Cooperstown, New York is Abner Doubleday's hometown. The Baseball Hall of Fame was put in Cooperstown because it's where Doubleday was from. But here's what's funny. When he was an old man, somebody interviewed Doubleday to see what he thought about inventing baseball. And Doubleday said, I didn't invent baseball. In fact, I don't think I've ever even seen a game of baseball. I don't even know the rules of baseball. It's a total myth. Don't believe it. Fun. All right, so back to Gettysburg. Doubleday took over the fighting, but he was outnumbered. Like I said, most of the Union Army wasn't there yet. The Union position was driven all the way back through town. The streets of Gettysburg were the scenes of a full street battle with gunfire in the streets and bullet holes hitting the buildings, like I said. They got back to these ridges and hills south of town. And by about 4 p.m., the Union officers who were there took what troops were already in Gettysburg and tried to coalesce them around Cemetery Hill late that afternoon. Pretty high ground. But again, they were outnumbered by the Confederates at that point. And this is one of those moments in Gettysburg that is still heavily debated to this day. And we'll have a chance to debate this. But when Robert E. Lee saw the Union troops mount Cemetery Hill, he gave an order to this guy. You remember that we mentioned him, that Richard or Dick Ewell was now in command of Stonewall Jackson's old troops, right? Okay, so Ewell found himself with his men at the base of Cemetery Hill looking up at the Union position. I want to quote Robert E. Lee directly, okay? Half hour after the Union took Cemetery Hill, Lee sent this message to General Richard Ewell. Take Cemetery Hill, and I quote directly, if practicable. I want you to think about what if practicable means, okay? It's a fancy way of saying take it if you think you can take it, all right? Now hold that thought. We'll come back to this debate in a second. Now, as the Union is sitting on Cemetery Hill and still outnumbered, another general for the Confederates arrived on the scene, and we will see a lot of James Longstreet as the war goes on. With Stonewall Jackson gone, James Longstreet basically became Robert E. Lee's right-hand man. But the difference was Jackson and Lee almost always agreed with each other. And if Jackson didn't agree with Lee, he swallowed that and just accepted that Lee was the commanding officer. Longstreet was a little more pushy, was a little more stubborn. Sometimes he disagreed with Lee openly, and they would fight once in a while. And one thing that really shows this disagreement, it's worth bringing up, we can talk about this later. When Longstreet arrived, he said to General Lee, we can't attack them on that hill, even though they don't have very many men up there. They have the high ground. They'll destroy us. He said, why don't we take our army? And rather than try to take them on that hill, let's get ourselves between Gettysburg and Washington, D.C. We've seen this strategy before. It's called a defensive strategy. The idea being is if the Confederates get themselves between Gettysburg and Washington, then Meade and the Union would have no choice but to abandon Cemetery Hill and attack the Confederate forces. Because if they don't stop the Confederates can walk all the way to Washington, D.C. And Lee was good at defense. But Lee was feeling confident. Remember, Lee always believed that God was on his side. So Lee and Longstreet had a big argument that afternoon. And Lee flat out said, we will not use this defensive strategy. In Lee's words, the enemy is there, meaning Cemetery Hill, and I shall attack him there. We will not go around. We will not hesitate. We're going to do a full frontal assault on this hill. Longstreet and Lee argued constantly. And in fact, later in the war, Longstreet was going to be pretty vocal, blaming some defeats on General Lee. And even after the war, Southern veterans kind of hated Longstreet for that. We'll get to that later. While Lee and Longstreet were arguing, while Dick Ewell was deciding whether taking Cemetery Hill was practicable or not, here comes a Union general with an awesome name. You may remember Union General Winfield Scott. Remember the big guy who was too fat to ride a horse when the Civil War began? We saw him way back in the Mexican War. Winfield Scott himself had retired by this point. But this is great. General Winfield Scott Hancock, a young up-and-coming general in the Union Army, was actually named after General Winfield Scott. Hancock's parents loved General Winfield Scott. Scott had been in the Army since the War of 1812. So they named their son after him. So that's how old Winfield Scott had been, is that now you've got a Union general in the Civil War who was named after that guy. But anyway, I digress. Okay, so Winfield Scott Hancock, brilliant Union general, one of the unsung heroes of the Battle of Gettysburg and beyond. He arrived in town. He looked and he saw the small force of Union troops on Cemetery Hill. He said, we got to make this stronger. We got to get more men up here. Get up on Seminary Ridge. Get up on all these ridges around here so we can be stronger and we can hold this high ground. And they had the time to do it because Dick Ewell at the base of Cemetery Hill decided it wasn't practicable. Remember, Lee had said, take Cemetery Hill if practicable. Now, there's plenty of people who will say, well, if Stonewall Jackson had been alive and Robert E. Lee told Jackson to take the hill if practicable, Jackson definitely would have taken the hill. I'll leave it up to you to decide what you think. I think there's probably some truth to that. There's probably some truth to the idea that Jackson would have tried to take it, okay? But here's the big debate that happens today, and I think it's worth further discussion. For years, Southerners placed the blame for Cemetery Hill staying in Union hands that night on Dick Ewell. And said, oh, Ewell is a coward. He's no Stonewall Jackson. Jackson would have taken it. But more and more, especially as historians study the full scale of the war and this battle and Lee's tactics in other places, think about the way Lee ordered this. He didn't say, Ewell, take Cemetery Hill. Because if he had said, take the hill, Ewell, whether he wanted to or not, would have had to follow orders and try to take that hill. But Lee said, take it if practicable. And today, a lot of people ultimately put the blame on Lee's shoulders for that hill not being taken. It's not a popular opinion in the South, but it is out there. Whoever you blame, though, the sun went down on July 1st. A lot of Southerners were swearing because they thought we had this chance to beat these Yankees on their own soil, and we didn't take it. And more Union troops are arriving in Gettysburg at this point. And as this is happening, guys, Hancock stayed up all night getting these troops into position. And by the time the sun came up on July 2nd, here's the scene. This map is not totally accurate if you want to get the scene on the morning of the second day at Gettysburg. Because if it was an accurate map on the morning, this line would have been a straight green line going all the way down here, right? You might notice in the Union position on this map that there's a bit of a gap there. That came later in the day, okay? Bottom line is when Hancock got the men into position, they were in what a lot of people call a fishhook formation. And it's all on this high ground, Culp's Hill, Cemetery Ridge, Cemetery Hill, places like that, right? The Confederates are all looking up at this high ground, trying to attack them. Well, okay, here's what we need to consider. Right? Not only is holding this high ground going to give the Union an advantage, but the Confederates have to be more spread out to try to attack this position. The Union's going to have the ability to reinforce places because their army is closer together, right? These are things that are going to work to the North's advantage as the rest of this battle plays out. But as far as that morning is concerned, when Lee woke up, He didn't care that the Union had all this high ground. He said, we can still get around them. That morning, he gave orders to James Longstreet, and the orders were very simple. Lee and Longstreet were standing up at their headquarters up in where you see the Hagerstown Road near the top left of the map. He says to Longstreet, I want you to take your men, I want you to march to the south, I want you to go around the Union Army. And Longstreet heard this, and he grumbled, and he didn't like it. But this was Lee's plan. Is he said, we're going to go around, and they're going to come out, and they're going to meet us. They're going to leave those hills, and they're going to meet us in battle. Well, Longstreet thought this was ridiculous. He said, they're not going to meet us in battle. They're going to stay up on the hills, no matter what. But he said to me, okay, you want me to do it? Fine. But he grumbled and grumbled. I think he was still mad because his proposal of a defensive strategy the day before had been rejected. Now, Longstreet really kind of took his sweet time waiting to move. Waited several hours, really, before he started attacking. But when he finally made his march, I'll show you this. Right, follow your cursor. He goes down on this orange line. And as he started marching down, and this is kind of a brilliant move on Longstreet's part, there was a bunch of clearings down here along the Emmitsburg Road where there were no trees. And then there was a bunch of trees to the south of there. Longstreet marched all the way through that clearing so that any Union soldiers, Union officers who watched his march would think he was just marching away. Then he got down into the forest to the south of town, turned all his men around, did what's called a counter march. And he's going to march clean back up to attack the Union position, thinking this time they won't see me coming because they expect me to go the other way. This explains why there's this big gap in the Union line. Because there was one Union general who figured out what Longstreet was trying to do. And now I need to introduce you to him. Okay. Whew, this guy's nuts. Let me introduce you to a great guy named General Daniel Sickles. Sickles is he's a little weird. All right. In fact, let's jump back before Gettysburg for a second. I kind of mentioned this about Sickles. He was a lawyer in New York City before the war. And he came home from work one day, found his wife in bed with another man. Went crazy. Killed the guy. Shot the other man dead. Was put on trial for murder. Dan Sickles and his lawyer invented the insanity defense. I was temporarily insane with jealousy. I can't be held accountable for my actions. And he got off. He got acquitted in this murder trial. So the guy who invented the insanity defense is now a Union general trying to defend this high ground against the Confederates. And Sickles sniffed out Longstreet's plan. He saw this counter march coming. And he actually kind of for a while played right into Lee's hands. Sickles took his men off this ridge and marched forward into what you see where it says Peach Orchard here. He did it without General Meade's approval. And in fact, when General Meade saw what Sickles was up to, Meade went crazy. Meade actually sent his chief of staff, who just happened to be George Meade Jr., to ride out to Sickles and say, General Meade orders you to pull back. Sickles basically said to George Meade Jr., hey, if your daddy wants me to pull back so bad, why doesn't he come and tell me himself? Yeah, this is what we got going on. So Sickles ignored Meade's demand to pull back, and he rode head out and met Longstreet in battle on this lower ground. Longstreet saw him coming, he attacked, and the battle was fierce on this ground for hours and hours. And one of the craziest things about the fighting there, this is insane, Sickles was on horseback, commanding his men. And out of nowhere comes a cannonball, hits him in the hip, sends Sickles flying one way, sends the leg next to the hip that was hit and flying the other way, tore his leg clean off his body, and Sickles gets thrown to the side. But this is what's nuts. Sickles survived this. And when some stretcher bearers came to take General Sickles away from the field, he says, I want to show my men that I'm strong and I'm going to survive. He made the men prop him up in the stretcher, put a lit cigar in his mouth so the men could see he was going to be okay. And as they're carrying him away, he says, oh, you forgot something. Don't forget my leg. He made the men go back and get his leg. And this is crazy. They put Dan Sickles' leg on display at the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington, D.C. It's still there. Today, it's just a skeletal leg in a glass case. But guys, Dan Sickles lived till like 1913 or 1915. Every year on July 2nd, Sickles and some friends took a train from New York City down to Washington, D.C., went to the National Museum of Health and Medicine, and drank a toast to Sickles' old leg to celebrate his actions at Gettysburg. Yeah. Whew. So Sickles is carried away, but his men are still stuck out there in this ground off these ridges. There's a little peach orchard there and things where they're fighting. And one of the spots that had the fiercest fighting between Sickles' men and Longstreet's men was a place you see in this picture. It's called Devil's Den. Very heavy boulders and large rocks. You might make for good cover, but it also makes for treacherous terrain to try to fight in. And I've been to Gettysburg half a dozen times. Every time I'm there, you see just families on vacation with their kids climbing around these rocks like they're, playground equipment. My little brother is a doctor, and he spent a year working at Gettysburg Hospital. And he said one of the most common injuries that he treated was tourists who fell off the rocks at Devil's Den. But anyway, so all this fighting was going on in the peach orchard at the rocks at Devil's Den. And I want to show you something that's kind of cool. One thing that the Civil War is characterized by is it's really the first war in human history that had a lot of photography involved. And people could actually see photographs of the war and of the dead of the war and see what the consequences of these battles were. And this is one of the most famous photos from the entire Civil War, and it comes out of the Battle of Gettysburg. It's called something like Death of a Georgia Sharpshooter. So this looks like, it's like an action shot. You could imagine this Confederate sniper hiding in his sniper's nest here at Devil's Den and taking a bullet and being killed. There's one problem with this picture. It was totally staged. This poor guy was a dead soldier, but the photographer had found him hundreds of yards away from the spot after the battle, dragged his corpse to this position, and set this whole scene. And I'll tell you, the first clue that this is a rigged shot is if a sniper had been shot behind his sniper's nest, I don't think the gun would have been laid up against the rocks so nicely and orderly. But these are the kind of images that people are seeing in newspapers across the country, really bringing the war home to them, making these horrible casualties kind of come to life. And the casualties at Gettysburg kept mounting. Because remember, Dan Sickles' move made that huge gap in that line as he pulled his men out to meet Longstreet. General Hancock was riding around behind the Union line, and he saw that gap. And he picked a regiment near him, the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry. These poor men from Minnesota were ordered to fill a gap, a weak spot in the Union line along Cemetery Ridge. And you wouldn't want to be in the 1st Minnesota for all the money in the world, because by Gettysburg, they had already lost a lot of men in other battles. There were 262 able-bodied men from Minnesota who were ordered to charge into this gap, facing 1,600 Confederate troops. It's not pretty. Only 47 men from the 1st Minnesota made it back from this attack. And I put a picture of, there's a monument at Gettysburg to the 1st Minnesota Infantry. It's one of the largest monuments of the whole battlefield, with good cause. And there are lots of monuments around the battlefield. And speaking of monuments, if you want to see a lot of monuments, you go to perhaps the most famous spot in the whole Gettysburg Battlefield Historic Park. Part of the reason it's so famous is because of the way this area was depicted in the famous novel The Killer Angels by Michael Shara. If you go south of the line, you can see a couple of hills down here. You've got Round Top and you've got Little Round Top. You don't need to think too hard to guess which one's bigger. Round Top was bigger. But Little Round Top was a pretty strategic spot. And you're going to see some of the most famous action in all of Gettysburg at this spot at Little Round Top. So I want to show you a couple of images here. There's a Union general who's memorialized in a bronze statue right here, standing atop Little Round Top. He got up there in the afternoon of July 2nd. There were no soldiers up there. And he realized this spot would be hugely strategic. If we could hold this hill, we could really secure the end of our line. We could secure our flank. So he quickly raced to get as many regiments up on Little Round Top as possible. And just for realism, in this picture, there's me standing next to the statue of this Union general. I wasn't there in July of 1863, but I'm there in this picture. So anyway, I wanted to show you two views of Little Round Top. Right? This picture with the statue and me is looking from the top. That's going to be the Union view. The picture on the lower left is what the Confederates saw, just so you get a sense of the size of these hills at the Gettysburg battlefield. Of course, in this picture, you can see a lot of the monuments that have been set up since the battle. Easily the most famous group of soldiers to fight in Little Round Top was a regiment from the state of Maine. And the 20th Maine Infantry was the extreme left flank of the Union Army at all of Gettysburg. They were the farthest left of any regiment in the entire Union line, and they found themselves on top of Little Round Top. Their colonel was a college professor from a college in Maine named Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And Chamberlain had joined the Army at the beginning of the war, risen to the rank of colonel, and now he was commanding the 20th Maine. And keep in mind, he was a college professor, okay? The soldiers in the 20th Maine stood on top of this hill all afternoon on July 2nd, repelling charge after charge from Confederate soldiers from Alabama that attacked their way up Little Round Top. And as the fighting continued, Chamberlain and the 20th Maine soldiers realized as the fighting went on, they were almost out of bullets. And after a few more charges, they were completely out of ammunition. The boys from the 20th Maine got together. They don't know what they're supposed to do because they know the Alabama regiment is going to charge up this hill again and try to take this hill. And they have to hold this hill at all costs because if the Confederates get past the 20th Maine, they could get around the entire Union line and could win the battle. So Chamberlain and the 20th Maine soldiers got together and they whipped up a plan. They're going to do an old school maneuver. They're going to fix their bayonets to the edge of their rifles, the knives that you can hook to the edge of your rifle. Soldiers from Alabama didn't know they were out of bullets. And the next time those Alabama soldiers came up the hill, Chamberlain and the 20th Maine fixed their bayonets. They stuck their bayonets at the front of their rifles. And rather than waiting at the top of the hill for the attack from the Alabama soldiers, the Maine soldiers charged down the hill right into the Alabama regiment. Took most of the Alabama soldiers captive. Chased the rest off without firing a shot because they had no bullets. Now, I should mention that Joshua Chamberlain survived the war. He went back to being a college professor. In fact, he was actually elected governor of Maine for a while based on his fame from Little Round Top and Gettysburg. He wrote an account of his experiences in the war. Some other veterans of the 20th Maine Infantry took issue with the way Chamberlain made it sound like he and he alone came up with the idea for this bayonet charge. They questioned his version of the account. But Chamberlain's a smart guy. He's a college professor. He got to tell his story. He lived to tell the tale, right? And he is, I would say, more famous than almost any other soldier at the Battle of Gettysburg, at least from the northern side today. In fact, they made a movie about Gettysburg back in the early 1990s starring Jeff Daniels, a pretty famous actor as Colonel Chamberlain. But just for comparison, I want to take you to the other side of the fighting. So check this map out. Here's Little Round Top, gets most of the attention. Chamberlain gets a lot of fame, okay? But look on the other side of the line. You see this giant orange arrow where the Confederates tried to take a place called Culp's Hill. The fighting there went on actually the fighting there lasted longer than the fighting at Little Round Top. The fighting at Culp's Hill lasted into the night and even into the morning of the next day. And on the extreme end of the Union line there, much like the 20th Maine was on the left side by Little Round Top, on the extreme right end of the Union line at Culp's Hill was a regiment called the 137th New York Infantry. They and their colonel, a man named David Ireland, pushed back the Southern assault at Culp's Hill. It's really very similar to what Chamberlain and the 20th Maine did at Little Round Top. So you have to ask yourself, how come when people talk about Gettysburg, almost everyone talks about Little Round Top and Chamberlain? Almost nobody talks about Colonel Ireland in the 137th New York. Well, remember what Chamberlain was, right? He was a college professor. And Chamberlain survived the war. Chamberlain got to tell his story, and he was an educated guy. He got to write a very powerful account of his experiences. Colonel Ireland was killed before the war ended. He didn't survive. He didn't get the chance to tell his story. You got to keep this in mind, guys. In all of history, our view of the past is shaped by the evidence presented to us. And everyone who writes their account of the story, they're keeping their audience in mind. They might even be embellishing their role once in a while. And we have to take these things with a grain of salt. When you do historical research, you can't just say, well, I found one source and that's all I need to know about the topic. You've got to get a multiple set of perspectives on any event in history, much like you'd have to do for Gettysburg, all right? But bottom line, all day on the second day of July, the second day of the fighting, the Confederates attacked the flanks. They attacked the flanks at Little Round Top. They attacked the flank at Culp's Hill. No success. The Union held both of these positions. So let's take a look at the last day of the fighting. The Union line is back together, all along these ridges, okay? Now, you see the arrows here in the middle. What's about to happen is generally seen as the most famous moment in the most famous battle in the Civil War. And it depends on how you remember it, whether you're from the North or the South. Because it's not going to go well for one side, and that's putting it mildly. Lee says to himself, well, I attacked the flanks yesterday, they held. They were pretty strong. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to attack the center of the Union line. It's not a bad strategy, except again, the Union had all night to fortify their line. They had more men there anyway. Having held a little round top on Culp's Hill, and as the fighting petered out and the Confederates stopped trying to attack those hills, the Union command realized, look, we don't need to have everybody in our army on those two hills because they're held. And they fortified the center of the line. They got most of their artillery, most of their cannons at the center of the position, ready for an attack. And it is not going to go well for the Confederates, to put it mildly. What's normally called Pickett's Charge in most accounts of this. If you're going to be really historically accurate, you have to call it the Pickett-Pettigrew Charge, because there's two Confederate generals from Virginia whose divisions were ordered to lead this charge on the Union center. Lee's going to send about 60,000 Confederate troops to march dead into the Union center of their position. But Lee's plan wasn't completely suicidal. He had bigger things on his mind. There's another piece that he's going to put in play before the frontal assault at the Union center is really going to take place. So I just want to mention this on the side. Remember Jeb Stuart, the Confederate cavalry commander, right? Lee also had another piece of his plan. And if it had been successful, we'd be having a very different conversation about Gettysburg today. Lee took most of his cavalry under Jeb Stuart. And the plan was they were going to attack the Union from the rear. While his infantry, while his foot soldiers attacked the Union from the front, the cavalry was going to come in from the rear and try to squeeze the Union position. But again, the Union was ready for this. The North had their cavalry, commanded by an officer you may have heard of. I don't know if you've heard of General Custer before. You might have heard of Custer's Last Stand a little over a decade after this. But before Custer got wiped out by the Sioux Indians out west, he was a young cavalry general in the Union Army in the Civil War, with a lot of connections to the state of Michigan, but that's another story. Custer and his Michigan Cavalry Brigade met Jeb Stuart in a huge cavalry-only battle in a big field a couple miles to the east of the main battle. If Custer and the Michigan Cavalry Brigade had lost this fight to Stuart, Gettysburg would be very different. But they held on. They repelled Stuart's cavalry, basically protecting the rear of the Union line and allowing the Union to focus entirely on the assault on foot from Pickett and Pettigrew's men. It's about to happen. And I want to show you the view here, all right? This is a relatively recent picture at Gettysburg. You're actually not allowed to walk on this ground past these rocks and past where I took these pictures because it's considered sacred ground in the Park Service. If you look at the picture of the Confederate view, you can see in the distance a cluster of trees. It's called the copse of trees. It's a little copse of trees that the Confederates used as their target. The idea was all 60,000 of these men were going to try to march right for those trees in the center of the Union line. Right behind the view in that Confederate view shot is a thick forest that 60,000 Confederate soldiers were about to march out from when they got the order. The Union view side shows the defensive position that they had set up, and you can see off in the distance the forest that the Confederates are going to march out of when they got the order to attack. Before the infantry march started, the Confederates launched a 2-hour barrage, a bombardment of artillery, of just cannon fire, trying to weaken the Union position. The noise was deafening. You could hear it from dozens and dozens of miles. You could hear it from Washington, D.C. But it didn't kill a lot of Union soldiers because the Union position, strongly fortified, the Union soldiers just ducked down behind these walls while the cannonballs mostly flew harmlessly over them. And at 3 o'clock that afternoon, General Longstreet, who thought this order was suicidal, was forced to order Pickett and Pettigrew to take their men out of the woods and march toward the Union position. Longstreet thought this was the dumbest thing he'd ever had to do. He thought Lee's plan was ridiculous. Longstreet was crying when he was told to give the order to charge out of these woods. He couldn't even speak. When he gave Pickett and Pettigrew the order to start this charge, all Longstreet could do was nod in their direction. He couldn't talk. He thought this was so suicidal. And there's a bit of an effort to dramatize or make this more legendary than it already is, which is hard. A lot of people tend to push this myth forward that after this charge, there was no hope for the Confederates to win the war. It's not really true. But it's often called, this moment right here before this charge is often called the high watermark of the Confederacy. Like if you imagine, if you go to a beach in the summer the mark on the seawall or on the shore where high tide was that day is a high water mark for the day. And the idea is that after this charge, the Confederate chances to win receded like after a tide. And I don't know if that's really true, but that's sort of the mythology that gets put out because of how devastating this charge was going to be for the South. 60,000 men marched across half a mile of open field. The Union just waited. The forest that the Confederates marched out of was out of their gunfire range. It was out of their cannon range. So the Union troops just waited until the Confederates marched closer. And once they got within range, the Union opened fire with their rifles and their cannons and decimated the Confederates in this charge. And there's stories of drama and powerful examples of heroism on both sides, but I just wanted to focus on one that I think is really powerful. It's depicted in this novel, The Killer Angels, too, that you should check out. So on the right, you've got Winfield Scott Hancock, who we've seen. And he was on horseback, riding around behind the Union soldiers to repel this charge. On the left is a Confederate general named Lewis Armistead. Armistead was on foot. Even though he was a general, he was on foot leading this charge. A lot of generals were leading this charge against the Union position. As Armistead got closer and closer to the Union position, he even took off his hat, and he had a ceremonial saber, and he put his hat on the saber and waved it around in the air as a vantage point to rally the Confederate troops to him. Now, if you flash back to 1861, Armistead and Hancock were best friends. They were stationed together at a U.S. Army fort in San Francisco, California. And they got a telegram at their fort about Fort Sumter surrendering and knew that the Civil War had begun. They were from different parts of the country. They knew they would have to remain loyal to their home regions, which meant that they'd be on opposite sides of this coming war. Armistead, Hancock, some other friends of theirs, including Albert Sidney Johnston, who we've seen, got together that night in San Francisco, had one last dinner together, toasted each other, basically said, you know, let's all remember that we're all friends, and hopefully after this war is over, we can all reunite in friendship. And now Armistead was leading a charge against his best friend's position. Armistead was one of the few officers from the Confederates to actually make it to the Union position in this charge. He actually got to the Union position and started having his men turn Northern cannons around and fire the cannons right into the Northern soldiers. While they're doing this, a stray Union bullet came and hit Armistead right in the chest. General Armistead was knocked to the ground. The wound was fatal. A Union soldier came up to see if Armistead was okay, like to offer this general some water, even though he's from the other side. And General Armistead said to this Union soldier, I have one dying request. I would like to see my friend General Hancock again before I die. I'm getting a little choked up talking about this. And the soldier had to say, General Armistead, I'm sorry to inform you, General Hancock has just been shot. General Hancock had just been shot off of his horse a few minutes earlier. Hancock did not die from his wounds. Hancock was taken to a field hospital and survived for years after this. But Armistead died on the spot, just a few hundred yards away from a reunion with his best friend in the world that never came. And these are the sorts of things that this war did to the country as a whole. It's that sort of thing that really, I think, makes the war appealing to a lot of people. But you can't focus just on these emotional stories, because otherwise you lose sight of the carnage, of the bloodshed, of the violence, of the other causes, of the fact that 4 million people are in slavery. I mean, we can't forget all of that. But if we're just focusing on this battle itself, this charge, this Pickett-Pettigrew charge, was completely lopsided in the North's favor. It just slaughtered the Confederates who charged into their teeth. When the Union troops repelled this charge, they started almost trash-talking the Confederates who survived, who were running back into the woods. They're chanting, Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg. You remember Fredericksburg, that battle a few months earlier where the Confederates held the high ground and the Union charged into certain death up that hill? Now the Union is saying, hey, the shoe's on the other foot. We're giving you a taste of your own medicine. And as the Confederates who survived this charge went streaming dejectedly back into the woods, they saw Robert E. Lee sitting on horseback crying, saying it was all his fault, sobbing. Of course, the Confederate soldiers wouldn't accept that. They wouldn't let Lee take the blame. They worshipped him as a god. But Lee actually tried to resign after Gettysburg, and Jeff Davis wouldn't let him. Davis said, if you resign, we may as well give up the war. And there's a full Confederate retreat of the straggling Confederate wounded and survivors of this charge. But if you look overall, guys, half of the soldiers from the Confederacy that went into that charge made it back alive. That's brutal. Guys, in the span of 3 days, of course, again, these are not all killed. These are killed, wounded, and missing. But 51,000 combined casualties in 3 days, it's hard to wrap your mind around that. And I'll tell you, one of the things that really hits me about Gettysburg is that, obviously Lee's northern invasion was repelled, and we can talk strategy and all that, but there are stories of civilians in Gettysburg who could not go outside of their homes for a month or two after the fighting because the amount of dead and wounded in the field was so high that they couldn't all be buried right away. And the stench of death in the air was that thick. These are the sorts of things that these battles lead to. We can't ignore that. But if we look big picture, General Meade, and stop me if you've heard this before, was ordered by Lincoln to pursue Lee's retreating army. Meade, in this case, I think rightly so, given the scope of the battle and the devastation that had just happened, didn't pursue. And Lee, again, was able to get back into Virginia. It's more of the same. Could have ended the war. Who knows? But the fact is, you're never going to see the Confederates enter Union soil again. There's never going to be another northern invasion by the South. Now, there's a myth out there, like I said, that says, oh, it's all over for the South at this point. Well, that's totally not true. We've got almost 2 more years of the war still to discuss. It's going to begin to turn the tide for the North, though. There is no doubt. But there's a lot of complexity yet to come. We can't ignore that, right? But as far as battles in the war go, there's none bigger. There's none more well-known. There's none that led to more casualties. The horror of Gettysburg stuck with this country for years and years. And as I said, you really, if you get a chance to get to Gettysburg, it's a must. You really should do it. In fact, I don't want to leave Gettysburg just yet. Let's pay a visit to the town a few months after the battle. Because in November of 1863, just to have us have a chance to step back and put this battle and this whole war in context for a second. In November of 1863, the U.S. government held a ceremony at Gettysburg to commemorate the battle and to consecrate this new cemetery that was being dedicated of all the Union dead at Gettysburg, as they had gradually been buried from July until November. And President Lincoln was invited to speak at this dedication ceremony of the Gettysburg Cemetery. When Lincoln got there, he stayed the night in the town. He wrote a quick address on some paper, just a few thoughts about what the war meant to him at that point. He wasn't even the first one to speak. Before Lincoln spoke, one of the most famous orators or speakers in the whole country at the time, a guy named Edward Everett, got up and talked for over 2 hours, quoting Shakespeare and Julius Caesar and poetry and going on and on for 2 hours about the bravery of these men. And there was thunderous applause after Edward Everett spoke. And then Lincoln got up to speak. And you're looking right now in this blurry photo at the only existing photograph of Abraham Lincoln at the Gettysburg Cemetery dedication. You can see him down here. He's the blurry bearded guy just sitting down. See, the photographer who was going to take pictures of Lincoln giving the speech figured, hey, Everett spoke for 2 hours. I've got time to set up my equipment before Lincoln's done talking. And you had to take your time setting up equipment for a Civil War photograph. So he's setting his stuff up, and the Gettysburg speech took 3 minutes to deliver, less than 3 minutes. So the crowd was actually kind of shocked that the speech was so short. So there's this real faint applause after Lincoln got done talking, and the photographer was like, oh man, oh God, I gotta take a picture. And he took this one real quickly, and that's all we get is a picture of Lincoln sitting down after the speech. But everybody knows the speech he gave. You've all heard of the Gettysburg Address. I'm assuming some of you have read it. Heck, I know there are students whose teachers make them memorize it for whatever reason. The thing is, we're always told, and I say rightly so, that this is one of the greatest presidential speeches in American history. That Lincoln in 3 minutes condensed condensed all the meaning of the war and the battle into 3 poetic, perfect minutes. Not everybody at the time believed that. Some people were so shocked that the speech was so short, they barely clapped. Other people said, what, that was it? That's all we got? My favorite reaction was from a Chicago newspaper from Lincoln's home state of Illinois. The next day, when they published the Gettysburg Address in their newspaper, this is what it said in their article. The cheek of every American must tingle with shame as he reads the silly, flat, and dishwatery utterances of the man who has to be pointed out to intelligent foreigners as the President of the United States. They ripped the speech apart. They thought it was so terrible. On the other hand, Edward Everett, the guy who had talked for 2 hours before Lincoln, wrote to him later, and he said to President Lincoln something to the effect of, "I would flatter myself if I came as close to the central theme of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 3 minutes." So Edward Everett thought the speech was great. Like I said, you all have heard the speech, we've read the speech. The one that begins 77 years ago. I think it's worth reading. I think it's worth soaking it in. Do yourself a favor. I won't read it to you right here. Honestly, though, do yourself a favor. Go on YouTube. There are YouTube clips of famous actors reading the Gettysburg Address, powerful renditions of it. Just read through it. It's short, but it's powerful. It's poetry. It talks about what the struggle is about, that we are dedicated to a new birth of freedom, because this is after the Emancipation Proclamation. It explains that this is about government of the people, by the people, and for the people. We are not fighting to preserve slavery and the power of the rich over the few, that we're fighting to preserve a nation for the people. And it's powerful words. And even in the present day, I think we need to be reminded of this, as current events seem to be shaping that message or challenging that message. So I really encourage you to check that out when you get a chance. Well, for now, we'll leave Gettysburg behind, and we'll see you again soon.